You keep returning to the same trap because it looks like virtue from the inside. You offer kindness. You soften. You clarify. You give the benefit of the doubt, and then you watch the other person treat you worse. The confusion is not that they failed to appreciate you. The confusion is that your kindness seems to invite contempt, escalation, or entitlement. So you do what your personality has trained you to do. You become even more reasonable. You explain your intention. You adjust your tone. You try to prevent harm by being careful. The cost is predictable. Your identity shrinks into a role whose only purpose is to keep the relationship from collapsing. That role feels necessary because it protects you from something older than the relationship itself, an internal punishment that arrives the moment you consider withdrawing warmth. You call it conscience. Often it is conditioning. The unconscious bargain is this: if I am kind enough, clear enough, patient enough, I will be safe. That is not kindness. That is a survival strategy that masquerades as character. When you act from this bargain, your kindness is not free. It is a transaction without terms, an offer of care that quietly asks for non-aggression in return. You may not notice the request because it lives below language, but other people notice it, not consciously, not morally, structurally. They sense that your kindness comes with a fear behind it, and fear is information. It tells them where your boundary is weak and where your self-definition can be negotiated. This is why they treated you worse after you were kind is not a mystery of human cruelty. It is often a predictable response to a pattern. Kindness offered as permission rather than kindness offered as choice. Permission is read as access. Access is tested. Testing is not always sadistic. It is how insecure or narcissistically organized people establish control. They push until they find the point where you stop being a person and become a function. Your kindness, especially when it arrives quickly, repeatedly, or after mistreatment, becomes the proof that consequences do not exist. Notice the mechanism. When you are kind after harm, you unintentionally convert harm into leverage. The other person learns, even if I cross the line, the relational field resets. They will come back. They will explain. They will repair. You think you are being mature. They experience you as containable. Your kindness becomes the rope they use to pull you back into the old position. The one who stabilizes, the one who understands, the one who absorbs. The more complex you make your explanations, the more you teach them that your reality can be negotiated by wearing you down. Here is the aha that usually arrives late. Your kindness did not trigger their cruelty. It exposed your assignment. You were already cast in a role, and your kindness signaled you would accept it. The role is not good person. It is regulator. You regulate their mood, their self-image, their shame, their loneliness, their boredom. You become the container for what they do not want to feel. And the moment you enter the regulator role, you step out of equal relationship. Equality is intolerable for certain dynamics because it requires mutual constraint. Control dynamics require asymmetry. One person expresses, the other adjusts. One person acts, The other explains, one person wounds, the other repairs. From a Jungian lens, the question is not why they became worse, but why your psyche keeps choosing the same relational geometry. This is where archetypes matter not as labels, but as gravitational forces. You are pulled toward the archetype of the caretaker, the mediator, the redeemer, the good child, the emotionally adult one. The archetype offers meaning. I am valuable because I can endure, understand, absorb, but archetypes also possess. When you are possessed by the caretaker, you confuse self-erasure with love. You call it compassion, when it is actually identity formed through adaptation. That adaptation usually begins early, when your nervous system learned a rule. Connection is maintained by managing the other person. In a father complex, the father may be unpredictable, critical, emotionally absent, or demanding. The child learns that warmth must be earned through performance, compliance, competence, or emotional caretaking. If the father's approval is scarce, the child becomes hyper-attuned, scanning for cues, adjusting before the blow lands, literal or psychological. Kindness in adulthood then becomes a reenactment of the child's strategy. If I stay soft, I can prevent punishment. The adult may call it being non-confrontational. The unconscious calls it obedience to an internalized father. In a mother complex, the mother may be engulfing, fragile, anxious, or emotionally hungry. The child learns that separation is dangerous because it triggers guilt. Withdrawal or collapse, the child becomes the mother's stabilizer, translator, emotional partner, or trophy. In adulthood, kindness becomes a reflexive tether. If I am firm, I will be responsible for their pain. This produces the compulsion to explain and over-clarify, because explanation is an attempt to avoid being cast as the aggressor. You are not trying to be understood. You are trying to avoid abandonment, retaliation, or guilt that feels like annihilation. These complexes do not stay in the past. They become internal authorities. The father complex speaks as a judge. Don't be difficult. Don't be selfish. Be respectable. The mother complex speaks as a moral creditor. Don't hurt them. Don't disappoint them. Don't let them feel alone. When you meet a narcissistically organized person, someone who requires admiration, control, or emotional supply, these internal voices align perfectly with the narcissistic demand. Your psyche has already been trained to provide what they seek: accommodation without limits and empathy without reciprocity. Narcissistic dynamics do not need a villain, they need a structure. In that structure, your kindness functions as supply in two forms. First, it provides emotional regulation. Your warmth calms their internal instability. Second, it provides moral cover. Your willingness to stay allows them to believe they are not abusive, only misunderstood and your explanations become the narrative that excuses them. The more intelligent and articulate you are, the more dangerous this becomes, because you can build elegant rationalizations for patterns that are not rational. Projection intensifies this. A narcissistically organized person often cannot tolerate their own dependency, vulnerability, or need. They split it off and locate it in you. You become too sensitive, too needy, too emotional, even as you are doing the labor of emotional containment. This is projection. They export disowned traits into you so they can attack them externally rather than feel them internally. Your kindness then becomes their evidence that you are indeed weak, because they equate kindness with dependence, and dependence with humiliation. They punish in you what they fear in themselves. Your shadow participates as well. The shadow is not just aggression. It is everything you have disowned to survive your early environment. If you had to be good, your shadow contains firmness, refusal, cold clarity, the capacity to disappoint, the capacity to end things without explaining. When the shadow is disowned, it does not disappear. It gets enacted indirectly. You may find yourself attracted to people who express your disowned power through domination, contempt, or emotional extremity. Their cruelty is the externalized form of your denied capacity to be decisive. You do not like it, but it has a fascination. It feels alive compared to your adaptation. This is why the empath narcissist entanglement is not a romantic mystery, but a psychological fit. The empathic person, in this context, is not morally superior. Empath often describes a nervous system trained to detect shifts in others for survival. That sensitivity can become a tool of self-erasure. You sense the other's mood before you sense your own boundary. The narcissistically organized person experiences that sensitivity as a resource. Someone else will monitor the emotional weather and adjust accordingly. Your kindness is not merely appreciated, it is exploited because it stabilizes the other person's internal chaos while destabilizing your selfhood. Pay attention to the repeating sequence. You are kind, they become worse. You respond by trying to fix the misunderstanding. That response is the hinge. The moment you treat disrespect as a communication problem, you abandon the reality that disrespect is often a power move, not a misunderstanding. Over-clarifying becomes a way of offering your inner world as evidence in a trial you never agreed to attend. You think you are providing context. In the relational economy of control, you are providing material to be reframed, mocked, or used later. Here, the collective unconscious enters not as mysticism, but as inherited relational scripts. Many cultures reward self-sacrifice, especially in certain roles: the dutiful child, the loyal partner, the peacekeeper. These scripts create a persona, the socially acceptable self that performs virtue. Persona is not false, it is partial. The danger is when the persona becomes your identity. If your persona is the kind one, then any boundary feels like a betrayal of self. You will endure more than you should. because leaving would collapse the persona that keeps you coherent. You would rather be mistreated than be the kind person who became cold. This is not morality, it is identity addiction. So when they treat you worse after you were kind, one of two things is happening. Either your kindness reveals their incapacity for reciprocity and triggers their defenses, or your kindness signals that you can be positioned beneath them. Often it is both. Kindness threatens the narcissistic structure because it implies mutuality, and mutuality implies limitation. But kindness also invites contempt when it arrives without consequence, because it communicates, I will adapt to keep connection. Narcissistic dynamics reward adaptation with further demand. They do not stop at what you give, they measure how much they can take. The question you must face is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of victim innocence without turning you into a culprit. What payoff keeps you in the pattern? There is always a payoff, even if it is miserable. The payoff might be the preservation of a self-image. I am the one who tries. The payoff might be the avoidance of guilt. At least I didn't abandon them. The payoff might be the familiar role that gives you a sense of purpose. Without me, they would fall apart. The payoff might be the avoidance of your own shadow. If you leave without explanation, you must tolerate being misunderstood, and that might activate old terror, father's condemnation, or mother's disappointment. Another mechanism. You may be unconsciously repeating the original family problem in the hope of mastering it. The child could not make the father warm or the mother stable. The adult searches for the same structure in different bodies, a withholding person, a volatile person, a self-centered person. Kindness becomes the attempt to finally win what was impossible then. If you can be kind enough to someone who punishes kindness, perhaps you can rewrite the past. But the psyche does not rewrite the past by repeating it. It reenacts it until it becomes visible. Visibility is precisely what the dynamic tries to prevent. If you name the pattern, the spell breaks, so the relationship will keep you busy. Arguments about tone, intentions, misunderstandings, communication styles. You will be recruited into endless analysis because analysis delays action. This is why the compulsion to explain is so central. Explaining is an avoidance strategy disguised as maturity. It keeps you engaged in a realm where you feel competent language rather than the realm where you feel terrified boundary and loss. There is a specific moment when the dynamic turns. It is not when they insult you, it is when you feel the impulse to be kind in order to restore equilibrium. That impulse is the complex activating. It is the internal authority saying, fix it, smooth it, make it safe. If you obey, you teach your psyche that safety comes from self-abandonment. You also teach the other person that your kindness is a reset button they can press by escalating. This is how the pattern becomes stable. Their worsening behavior is reinforced by your reparative kindness. You might resist this because it sounds like blaming you for their behavior. It is not. The other person's cruelty is theirs. What belongs to you is the structure that keeps you present and negotiating after the cruelty appears. Jung's interest is always the same, not the surface event, but the inner participation. Participation does not mean fault, it means the psyche is involved. If your psyche were not involved, you would not need to understand why they became worse. You would see it, register it, and your position would change. The reason you need a theory is that leaving the position threatens your identity. Loss of self through relational roles is not dramatic, it is gradual. It starts with small edits. You remove a sentence, you soften a boundary, you delay a truth, you translate your need into something more palatable. Over time, you become a person who speaks in footnotes. You preface, you apologize, you contextualize, you attempt to be impossible to accuse, but being impossible to accuse is the fantasy of a child who had to survive accusation. An adult who has a self can be accused and remain intact. The one who lacks a stable self experiences accusation as collapse, so they become endlessly careful. That carefulness is visible to predatory dynamics. It smells like negotiability. Your shadow is the part that would stop explaining, not to be cruel, but to be clear. Clarity is not a mood, it is a posture. This is what is happening. This is what I will and won't participate in. If that posture terrifies you, it is because you associate it with losing love. That association did not come from adult reality. It came from your early system. In some families, love was conditional on compliance. In others, love was conditional on caretaking. In either case, boundary felt like betrayal. So you developed a persona of kindness that ensured belonging. The persona worked then, now it traps you. When a narcissistically organized person meets your persona, they do not see your soul, they see your function. This is not because they are evil. It is because they relate to people as instruments for regulating their self-esteem. If you provide regulation, you are kept. If you demand reciprocity, you are punished or replaced. Your kindness is valued only insofar as it is useful. The moment you become a person with needs, your kindness is recoded as manipulation. You're only kind to get something. That accusation is projection. They assume your motives are transactional because theirs. So your kindness triggers a backlash because it quietly exposes their inner poverty. Genuine kindness implies a capacity for gratitude and reciprocity. If they lack it, they must destroy the implication. They do this by devaluing you. If you are pathetic, your kindness no longer demands gratitude. It becomes something they are entitled to. Devaluation protects them from shame. If they admit you are generous, they might have to admit they are taking. That admission is unbearable to a structure built on denial. Watch how quickly the dynamic shifts after you are kind. They push for more. They test boundaries. They become colder. They vanish. They criticize. This is not randomness. It is calibration. They are mapping what your kindness means. Is it strength or is it fear? If it is strength, it comes with limits. If it is fear, it comes with surrender. Many people are kind with limits. They are not trapped in this pattern. The pattern appears when kindness is paired with anxiety, when you cannot tolerate the other person's displeasure, when you rush to repair your own boundary as if it were a crime. At some point, you must stop asking why they treated you worse and start seeing what your psyche has been trained to call love. If love in your system means tension, uncertainty, and earning, then calm reciprocity will feel dull, and contempt will feel strangely familiar. Familiarity is not health, it is imprint. The psyche repeats imprint until it is made conscious. Consciousness here does not mean insight as entertainment. It means the ability to feel the impulse to over-explain and not obey it. It means tolerating the guilt that arises when you do not rescue the relationship from its own consequences. This is where the mirror becomes sharp. If you keep choosing kindness as a way to avoid loss, you will keep meeting people who use your fear of loss as a handle. They will treat you worse because they can, not because you deserve it, because your pattern makes it possible. And their pattern makes it likely. Two unconscious structures lock together. The tragedy is not that they are cruel. The tragedy is that your kindness is not anchored in self, so it becomes a currency you spend to purchase temporary safety. Kindness anchored in self looks different. It does not chase. It does not negotiate reality. It does not explain to people who are committed to misunderstanding. It can be warm and still final. It can be compassionate and still disinterested in persuading. If this sounds cold, that reaction is your complex speaking. The complex equates firmness with abandonment, because firmness once meant loss, but firmness is often what finally reveals who you are dealing with. Many dynamics survive kindness. They do not survive consequence. You will know you are in the old trap when you feel compelled to prove your goodness. Proving is always a sign the self has been replaced by persona. The self does not prove, it stands. If you cannot stand without being liked, you do not yet have a stable identity. You have a role, and roles can be exploited indefinitely because they are designed to serve a system, not a person. This is not a call to become harsh. It is a demand to see the mechanism you keep calling being kind. If your kindness repeatedly results in being treated worse, your kindness is being used as an entry point into your lack of boundary. The pattern is now visible. Kindness offered as appeasement becomes permission. Permission invites testing. Testing reveals self-erasure. Self-erasure invites contempt. Contempt triggers more appeasement. Once you see the loop cannot be unseen. You can still participate, but you will no longer be able to claim confusion as innocence. You will know what you are doing and what it costs. When the pattern continues despite your intelligence, insight, and emotional literacy, it is because the pattern is not cognitive. It is embodied. It lives in the autonomic responses that activate before thought. The tightening when someone withdraws, the urgency when tension appears, the relief when harmony is restored, even if harmony is false. You do not choose these reactions. They arise from an internal economy shaped long before adult reasoning existed. This is why understanding alone never stopped you from being kind in the wrong places. The compulsion operates beneath insight. The psyche organizes itself around what once ensured survival. If appeasement kept attachment intact in childhood, appeasement becomes encoded as safety. The adult mind may call it kindness, maturity, or empathy, but the nervous system experiences it as relief from threat. The moment someone becomes displeased, distant, or critical, the old alarm sounds. Connection is at risk. Your body moves to restore equilibrium before your conscious values have time to intervene. This is not weakness. It is conditioning that has outlived its usefulness. The danger appears when this conditioning is mistaken for virtue. You begin to believe your identity is your responsiveness. You do not simply act kindly. You are the kind one. That identity becomes fragile. It must be maintained. Any rupture threatens not just the relationship, but your coherence. So when someone treats you worse after kindness, the problem is not only their reaction, it is that your identity leaves you no room to respond differently without experiencing internal collapse. This is how identity formed through adaptation works. It is not chosen. It is assembled in response to pressure. The child discovers what reduces tension and repeats it until it becomes character. Over time, the adaptation hardens into self-concept. This is who I am. Jung was precise here. When adaptation replaces individuation, the personality becomes functional but hollow. It works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, the individual feels betrayed by life, not realizing life is exposing the limits of a survival structure mistaken for self. This exposure often occurs through relationships that escalate rather than soften in response to kindness. These relationships act as mirrors, not teachers. They do not reward virtue, they reveal structure. When someone becomes more demanding, more dismissive, or more entitled after you accommodate them, they are responding to a signal. You have prioritized connection over self-definition. In relational systems, that signal reorganizes power immediately. Power does not mean dominance. It means who sets reality. When you rush to explain, soften, or repair, you concede reality setting authority. You make your internal state dependent on their response. The compulsion to explain deserves particular attention because it masquerades as intelligence and fairness. Explanation feels ethical. If they understand me, things will improve. But explanation in these dynamics is not about understanding. It is about control, anxiety. You explain because you cannot tolerate being misread. Misreading feels dangerous because it once led to punishment, withdrawal, or chaos, so you attempt to manage perception. The problem is structural. You are trying to regulate another person's interpretation to preserve your safety. That effort puts you beneath them psychologically. Whoever explains is already in the inferior position. Because explanation assumes the other person has the authority to judge, narcissistic dynamics exploit this reflex. Not because narcissistic individuals are always calculating, but because their internal structure demands it. They experience other people primarily in terms of utility to their self-image. When you explain, you offer them interpretive power. They can accept, reject, distort, or weaponize your words. The more complex and nuanced your explanation, the more material you provide. This is why you leave these conversations feeling exposed and exhausted. You have handed over your interior in the hope of fairness, and fairness was never the governing principle. Projection intensifies the bind. When you explain, you reveal vulnerability. A narcissistically organized psyche cannot tolerate vulnerability without converting it into weakness. They project their own disowned fragility onto you and then attack it. Your kindness then becomes the evidence for their narrative. You're too much. You're too emotional. You're trying to manipulate me with your feelings. This accusation is particularly destabilizing because it inverts reality. You are trying to maintain connection. They accuse you of control, but projection does not care about accuracy. It cares about protecting the ego from shame. At this point, many people double down on kindness to disprove the accusation. This is the trap tightening. You try to show you are not manipulative by being even more accommodating. The narcissistic structure interprets this as confirmation that pressure works. Their behavior worsens because it is being reinforced. This is not sadism, it is conditioning. Systems repeat what yields results. Your shadow is present here as what you refuse to allow yourself. The capacity to let misunderstanding stand, the ability to be seen inaccurately and remain intact. This capacity develops only when the self is stronger than the persona. But if your persona is the self, if being kind is how you exist, then being misunderstood feels like annihilation. So you fight misunderstanding with explanation. You believe clarity will save you. In reality, clarity without boundary is exposure. The father and mother complexes deepen this vulnerability. The father complex often trains obedience to authority and fear of disapproval. When someone becomes cold or critical, the internalized father awakens. You are failing, fix it. You become earnest, apologetic, precise. You try to demonstrate good faith. The other person feels this shift immediately. Your posture changes. Authority consolidates on their side. They may not consciously enjoy it, but they respond to it. Your kindness becomes submissive, and submission invites either exploitation or contempt. The mother complex operates differently but with similar consequences. It trains responsibility for others' emotional states. If someone reacts badly to your kindness, you assume you misstepped. You search for what you did wrong. You try to soothe. You try to restore warmth. You fear being the cause of distress. This fear makes it nearly impossible to withdraw from someone who escalates after kindness, because withdrawal feels like cruelty. You would rather be mistreated than be the one who hurts. Both complexes produce a distorted moral economy. You measure goodness by endurance. You equate staying with virtue and leaving with failure. This is why being treated worse after kindness creates paralysis rather than clarity. The pattern violates your moral expectations, but your complexes prevent you from responding with consequence. You are caught between insight and obedience. The collective unconscious reinforces this bind through cultural narratives that glorify patience, self-sacrifice, and emotional labor, often unevenly distributed. You are taught that kindness redeems relationships, that understanding heals wounds, that love requires effort. These ideas are not false, they are incomplete. Without differentiation, they become weapons against the self. You absorb the collective myth and apply it indiscriminately, including in contexts where power imbalance makes it destructive. The loss of self through relational roles is subtle. You do not wake up erased. You wake up tired, confused, resentful without permission to feel resentment. You begin to doubt your perceptions because they conflict with your identity. If I am kind, this shouldn't be happening. When reality contradicts identity, the psyche often chooses identity. You question yourself instead of the structure. This self-doubt is then interpreted by the other person as weakness, which further destabilizes the dynamic. There is a moment, often brief, when the self attempts to intervene. You feel a flicker of anger, distance, or indifference. You imagine not explaining. You imagine letting the relationship suffer its own consequences. Immediately, guilt appears, anxiety, images of abandonment, accusations from the internal parent. This is the cost of individuation pressing against the defenses of adaptation. Most people retreat at this point. They return to kindness because kindness feels like relief. But relief is not resolution, it is sedation. The psyche pays for sedation later. Resentment accumulates. Vitality drains. You become hollowed out, functioning but dimmed. Jung described the state as a life lived on borrowed terms. You are alive, but not altering. When kindness is no longer chosen but compelled, it ceases to be ethical. It becomes mechanical. And mechanical kindness does not humanize, it deforms. Narcissistic dynamics thrive in this deformation. They do not need you to be happy. They need you to be predictable. Your kindness makes you predictable. They learn exactly how far they can go before you attempt to restore harmony. They learn that your threshold is high and your consequences are negotiable. When they treat you worse after kindness, they are responding to that data. Again, not consciously, not maliciously in every case, but structurally. It is important to see that not everyone who responds this way is narcissistic in the clinical sense. Many people are simply organized around insecurity, entitlement, or unintegrated shadow, but the effect is the same. Kindness without boundary destabilizes the relational field. It removes friction, and friction is what creates mutuality. Without it, the relationship slides into hierarchy. You may wonder why some people respond beautifully to kindness while others exploit it. The answer lies in ego strength. A person with sufficient ego strength can receive kindness without experiencing it as threat or invitation to dominate. A person without it must either idealize you or devalue you. Idealization feels good, but is unstable. Devaluation follows quickly when you disappoint. Your kindness accelerates this cycle because it raises the stakes of reciprocity. If they cannot reciprocate, they must destroy the value of what they receive. Here the shadow returns, not as aggression, but as the disowned capacity to be unresponsive, to not engage, to not explain. Silence terrifies those whose identity depends on being needed. But silence is often the only position that restores balance. Not performative silence, not withdrawal as punishment, but the absence of self-betrayal. When you stop offering kindness as a bargaining chip, the dynamic reveals itself quickly. Those who valued you as a person adjust. Those who valued you as a function escalate or exit. This revelation is often misinterpreted as loss. It feels like relationships are collapsing. In reality, roles are dissolving. The psyche experiences this as grief because roles provided structure, but structure is not self. Individuation requires the loss of roles that no longer serve the whole personality. This loss is not dramatic. It is quiet and unsettling. You realize how many connections were sustained by your effort alone. You may notice a new discomfort emerging. The discomfort of not being immediately understood, liked, or reassured. This discomfort is the price of reclaiming authorship. It does not promise relief, it promises clarity. When you no longer rush to explain, you begin to see who relates to you and who relates to your labor. The difference is stark. Being treated worse after kindness is not evidence that kindness is wrong. It is evidence that kindness alone cannot carry the weight of identity. Without self, kindness becomes appeasement without boundary. Empathy becomes exposure without consequence. Generosity becomes permission. These are not moral failures. They are structural imbalances. Seeing them requires relinquishing the fantasy that goodness guarantees safety. At this stage, the psyche faces a stark choice that feels less like choice and more like necessity. Continue performing kindness as a way to manage fear, or tolerate the anxiety of not rescuing the relational field. There is no promise attached to the second option. It does not guarantee better relationships. It guarantees only that what remains will be real. When you stop interpreting this pattern as a series of unfortunate encounters and begin seeing it as a psychological position, you occupy a different kind of discomfort emerges. It is no longer the pain of being mistreated. It is the destabilization that comes from recognizing your own participation. Not guilt, not blame, recognition. The recognition that you have been organizing your relationships around preventing a specific internal catastrophe rather than around mutual reality. That catastrophe is not conflict. It is the collapse of the role that once kept you safe. This is why kindness, in your case, has weight. It is not neutral. It is charged with history. When you are kind, you are not only offering warmth, you are reaffirming an internal contract. I will be what is required to keep connection intact. The problem is not that this contract exists. The problem is that it has not been renegotiated since childhood. It still assumes the stakes of a dependent nervous system in an adult world that no longer requires submission for survival. In Jungian terms, this is the difference between ego adaptation and individuation. Adaptation allows you to function in an environment. Individuation requires that you become distinct from it. When adaptation dominates too long, the ego becomes skilled but hollow. It knows how to respond but not how to originate. It waits for cues. It monitors reactions. It anticipates displeasure. Your kindness then is reactive rather than generative. It responds to threat, not to value. This distinction matters because reactive kindness is legible to others. It carries an urgency that invites testing. People sense when warmth is freely given and when it is guarding against something. Insecure or narcissistically organized individuals are particularly sensitive to this difference because they live in a world of unspoken hierarchies. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. Who is managing whom? When your kindness arrives with anxiety behind it, it signals that you are managing the relationship, and whoever manages becomes responsible. Responsibility in these dynamics is not shared. It accumulates. The more you take on, the less the other person has to carry. This is how imbalance becomes normalized. You absorb tension. You smooth rupture. You translate feelings. Over time, the other person's capacity for self-regulation atrophies. They become more demanding, more volatile, or more indifferent. You then interpret this as proof that they need you, which reinforces your role. This is the closed loop that turns kindness into a trap. The narcissistic dynamic sharpens this loop because narcissistic organization is defined by a fragile core protected by defenses. One of those defenses is entitlement, the belief that others exist to stabilize the self. When you provide that stabilization consistently, you confirm the defense. Your kindness becomes evidence that entitlement is justified. When you inevitably falter or ask for reciprocity, the defense activates. You are devalued, criticized, or punished, not because you did something wrong, but because you violated the implicit contract. You exist to regulate me. Here, projection plays a decisive role. The narcissistically organized person cannot tolerate their dependence on you. Dependence implies vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens their self-image. So they project dependence onto you. They accuse you of needing too much, of being clingy, emotional, or demanding. This accusation is destabilizing because it reverses the truth. You are providing they are consuming. But the psyche that uses projection does not care about accuracy. It cares about preserving internal coherence. By casting you as needy, they maintain the illusion of autonomy. Your response to this accusation reveals the depth of the pattern. If you rush to defend yourself, to explain your independence, to reassure them that you are not asking for much, you accept the frame, you argue within their reality, you attempt to prove that you are not what they project. In doing so, you validate their authority to define you. This is how explanation becomes submission. Not because explanation is inherently weak, but because in this context it is offered to someone who has no intention of understanding. The father and mother complexes again determine your reaction. The father complex compels you to defend your worth. You want to show that you are reasonable, balanced, mature. You present evidence. You make a case. The internal judge demands acquittal. The mother complex compels you to soothe the accusation. You want to reassure them that they are safe, that you are not a burden, that you do not need much. You fear being experienced as draining. In both cases, your energy moves outward. You abandon your position to manage theirs. This outward movement is the loss of self in real time. The self does not argue for its right to exist. It does not negotiate its boundaries. It simply is. But if your sense of being was never allowed to stand on its own, if it always had to justify itself, then standing feels like aggression. You confuse presence with threat. You confuse firmness with harm. This confusion keeps you locked in relational roles long after they have ceased to be necessary. The collective unconscious supports this confusion through moral narratives that equate goodness with self-denial. You may have internalized the idea that being kind means being available, forgiving, flexible, and endlessly patient. These qualities are not pathological in themselves. They become pathological when they are disconnected from self. When kindness is offered at the expense of truth, it ceases to be relational. It becomes appeasement. Appeasement does not produce intimacy. It produces dependency and resentment. Resentment is the psyche's way of signaling that something essential is being violated. Many people in your position deny resentment because it contradicts their identity. I'm not angry. I understand them. Understanding becomes a defense against anger. But anger, in its healthy form, is information. It signals boundary violation. When anger is disowned, it does not disappear. It turns inward or leaks out indirectly through fatigue, sarcasm, withdrawal, or depression. You may find yourself feeling numb rather than furious. Numbness is often anger that has lost permission to speak. The shadow in this pattern contains your capacity to disappoint, to let someone feel the impact of their behavior without rushing to repair it. This capacity feels cruel to you because it was once forbidden. In childhood, letting a parent feel disappointed may have resulted in withdrawal, rage, or collapse, so you learn to preempt disappointment by adapting. As an adult, this adaptation persists even when the other person is not fragile but entitled. You treat entitlement as if it were vulnerability. This misattribution keeps you trapped. Misattribution is one of the most consistent mechanisms here. You misattribute cruelty to woundedness, exploitation to insecurity, control to fear. While these attributions may be psychologically accurate, they are relationally irrelevant. Understanding the origin of someone's behavior does not obligate you to tolerate its effect. When you confuse explanation with obligation, you sacrifice your position. You become a therapist in relationships that require boundaries, not insight. The psyche resists relinquishing this position because it offers a sense of superiority disguised as morality. You may not like this idea, but it deserves examination. Being the kind one can conceal a subtle inflation. I'm more evolved, more understanding, more compassionate. This inflation compensates for powerlessness. It allows you to feel valuable without risking confrontation. Jung warned repeatedly that inflation and inferiority are two sides of the same complex. Where there is excessive humility, there's often hidden grandiosity. The grandiosity lies in believing you can redeem dynamics that are structurally unequal. When kindness fails repeatedly, it exposes this inflation. You are forced to confront the possibility that your presence is not transformative, that your patience does not heal, that your understanding does not change someone who benefits from not changing. This confrontation is painful because it dismantles a cherished self-image, but it is also liberating. You are released from the impossible task of being the solution. At this stage, many people experience a strange reversal. They stop offering excessive kindness, and the other person reacts with hostility, withdrawal, or contempt. This reaction is often interpreted as proof that you were wrong to change. In reality, it is confirmation of the structure. The relationship was sustained by your labor. When the labor stops, the structure collapses. What remains is not love wounded by distance, but dependence exposed by absence. The psyche often interprets this collapse as loss. You grieve not only the relationship, but the role it gave you. You may feel empty without the constant demand. This emptiness is not evidence that you need the dynamic. It is evidence that your identity was organized around it. When the role dissolves, there is a gap. That gap is where the self emerges not as comfort, but as orientation. Orientation is subtle. It is the sense that your actions originate from an internal reference point rather than from reaction. You begin to notice impulses without immediately obeying them. The impulse to explain arises, you do not act. The impulse to soothe arises, you pause. This pause is not indifference, it is differentiation. In the pause, you feel anxiety, guilt, fear. These effects are the residue of old complexes losing their authority. If you can tolerate them without acting them out, something reorganizes. This reorganization is not dramatic. There is no catharsis. There's often loneliness, but the loneliness is different from abandonment. It is the loneliness of no longer being mirrored by roles. You are no longer immediately needed. You are no longer constantly engaged. This can feel like disappearance. In reality, it is the first time your presence is not defined by function. From this position, you begin to see the pattern retroactively with clarity. You see how often your kindness arrived after disrespect, not before. You see how often you gave when the other person withdrew. You see how rarely your kindness was reciprocated without prompting. These observations are not used to indict the other person, but to reclaim reality. Reality had been softened to preserve identity. Now it hardens, and the hardening is painful but stabilizing. It is important to understand that none of this guarantees better outcomes. Some relationships will end, others will transform. Some people will accuse you of becoming cold, selfish, or distant. These accusations will hurt because they echo old fears, but they will also reveal something essential. Who benefited from your lack of boundary? The psyche that is individuating learns to accept this revelation without rushing to correct it. At this point, kindness changes character. It is no longer automatic. It is chosen. It may appear less frequent but more grounded. It does not rush to attention. It does not attempt to rescue. It does not require recognition. It exists alongside firmness. This combination confuses those accustomed to your predictability. They may escalate to provoke the old response. If the response does not come, the dynamic exhausts itself. You may notice a new clarity about responsibility. You stop feeling responsible for how others interpret you. You stop managing impressions. This does not make you reckless. It makes you proportional. You respond to what is actually happening rather than to what you fear might happen. This proportionality is often mistaken for detachment. In truth, it is engagement without self-erasure. The most difficult realization arrives quietly. Much of what you called kindness was an attempt to secure belonging, when belonging no longer depends on performance. Kindness becomes free. Until then, it remains a strategy. Strategies are exhausting because they must be constantly monitored. Freedom requires less effort, but more tolerance for uncertainty. When you see this, the original question, why they treated you worse after you were kind, loses its emotional charge. The answer is no longer personal. It is structural. You were kind in a way that signaled availability without consequence. They responded according to their organization. The pattern repeated because it worked for both psyches. One avoided abandonment, the other avoided responsibility. Once seen, this symmetry cannot be unseen. This is not resolution, it is orientation. You are no longer confused by the worsening after kindness. You recognize it as a predictable response to a familiar position. Whether you continue to occupy that position is no longer a mystery, but a decision, one that will be felt long before it is articulated. What remains when the pattern is fully visible is not relief, but exposure. You are exposed to the fact that much of what you called who I am was a posture learned under pressure. That exposure is unsettling because it removes the moral cushion that once softened reality. You can no longer tell yourself that kindness will eventually correct imbalance. You can no longer pretend misunderstanding is the core problem. You are left with structure, and structure is unforgiving. At this stage, the psyche often tries one last defense, reinterpretation. You may be tempted to reframe the pattern as tragic, as unfortunate, as the result of meeting the wrong people. This keeps the self just out of reach. Because if it were only about others, you would not have to relinquish the organizing principle that has governed your life. Jung was clear that when insight approaches transformation, resistance intensifies not as denial, but as subtle diversion. The mind seeks explanations that preserve identity. The identity at stake here is not the empath as a moral category, it is the identity of indispensability. You have learned to exist by being needed, by being the one who understands, the one who absorbs tension, the one who makes things work. When kindness is removed from that system, you feel unnecessary. That feeling is misinterpreted as emptiness or loss of meaning. In reality, it is the collapse of a role that substituted for self. The self is not experienced as warmth or reassurance. It is experienced as solidity. Solidity feels strange if your nervous system has been trained around responsiveness. You are accustomed to movement adjusting, anticipating, repairing. Solidity feels inert by comparison. It does not rush to fill silence. It does not soften discomfort immediately. It allows situations to declare themselves. This is why solidity is often mistaken for coldness. It does not perform concern to manage outcomes. When you occupy this solidity, something becomes unmistakable. Many people were not responding to you, they were responding to your availability. When availability recedes, their behavior clarifies. Some will attempt to provoke you back into the old position. They may escalate criticism, to dramatize distress, or accuse you of changing. This is not evidence that you have become cruel. It is evidence that the system is losing a stabilizing function. At this point, the temptation to return to kindness as appeasement is strongest. The guilt is sharp. The internalized parent speaks loudly. You're being unfair. You're abandoning them. You're not being who you used to be. This voice mistakes consistency for integrity. It confuses repetition with character. Integrity does not require you to remain in roles that destroy your coherence. Integrity requires alignment between inner reality and outer action. If your kindness contradicts your reality, it is no longer integrity, it is compliance. The father and mother complexes make this moment feel dangerous. The father complex warns of punishment, disapproval, rejection, loss of status. The mother complex warns of harm, the other's pain, loneliness, collapse. These warnings are echoes, not prophecies. They are memories of dependency masquerading as intuition. If you obey them automatically, you remain psychologically young. If you can hear them without acting, something adult consolidates. This consolidation is not aggressive. It does not require confrontation or explanation. In fact, explanation weakens it, consolidation is quiet. You stop volunteering your interior, you stop justifying your position, you let the other person experience the absence of your management. This absence is not punishment, it is reality without your mediation. Many dynamics cannot survive unmediated reality. From the outside, it may look as though you have withdrawn kindness. From the inside, it feels as though kindness has been relocated. It is no longer directed outward as a tool for safety. It is directed inward as a condition of coherence. This shift is often misunderstood as selfishness, but selfishness seeks advantage. This seeks alignment. There is no gain promised here, only the end of chronic self-violation. One of the most sobering realizations in this phase is that your kindness was never the problem. The problem was the absence of consequence. Kindness without consequence invites misuse because it removes friction. Friction is not hostility, it is differentiation. Without differentiation, relationships collapse into functions. One gives, the other takes, one adjusts, the other demands. Kindness does not correct this, only boundary does. Boundary, in this context, is not a rule or a statement. It is a non-negotiable orientation. You do not move against yourself to preserve connection. This orientation is felt before it is spoken. Others sense it quickly. Those who are capable of reciprocity adjust, those who require asymmetry escalate or leave. This sorting is not intentional, it is structural. When you no longer provide what sustains the imbalance resolves itself. You may notice that some people become suddenly respectful, even cautious. This can be confusing. You may wonder why respect appears only after warmth recedes. The answer is uncomfortable, but precise. Respect emerges when your presence is no longer guaranteed, not because you are playing a game, but because your psyche is no longer offering itself as a resource. Scarcity here is not manipulation. It is the byproduct of no longer overextending. This does not make you powerful. It makes you legible. You are no longer readable as someone who can be pressured indefinitely. Pressure loses its effectiveness. When pressure fails, those who relied on it experience anxiety or anger. They may accuse you of becoming distant, different, or cold. These accusations are not evaluations. They are protests. The system is protesting the loss of your compliance. At this point, you are faced with a choice that is not framed as a choice. You can either reinterpret these protests as evidence of your wrongdoing and return to the old position, or you can tolerate being miscast while remaining intact. Tolerating miscasting is one of the most difficult psychological tasks for someone whose identity formed through adaptation. You are used to correcting perception. You must now allow it to remain incorrect. This allowance feels like moral failure at first. It feels irresponsible. But responsibility for others' interpretations was never yours. You assumed it because you were trained to manage reality. Letting go of this responsibility produces anxiety because it removes a familiar sense of control. But control was purchased at the cost of self. What emerges in its absence is not chaos but proportion. Proportion is the capacity to respond according to what is actually present, not according to inherited fear. You stop over responding to minor cues. You stop under responding to major violations. Your reactions become simpler, not harsher. You no longer need elaborate explanations because you are no longer trying to convince. You are orienting. From this orientation, the original experience, being treated worse after kindness, appears almost mechanical. It is no longer personal. It is understood as the interaction of two unexamined structures. One structure offered itself to prevent loss. The other consumed to prevent shame. Neither was conscious. Neither was evil. Both were predictable. Seeing this removes both resentment and nostalgia. There is nothing to romanticize and nothing to avenge. The final discomfort is this: you can no longer claim innocence through confusion. You see the bargain, you see the role, you see the payoff. This does not mean you must act perfectly. It means you can no longer unknow. When you are kind now, you will feel immediately whether it is chosen or compelled. If it is compelled, you will feel the familiar tightening, the urgency, the subtle fear. If you act anyway, you will know why, and you will know the cost. This knowledge does not promise better outcomes. It promises accuracy. You may still choose kindness in situations that do not deserve it. You may still stay longer than you should, but you will not tell yourself stories about why. You will see the mechanism operating in real time. That visibility changes the psychic economy. What is seen loses its compulsive power. The lecture does not end with resolution, because resolution would imply an end point. There is none. There is only a shift in what you can tolerate and what you can no longer pretend. You will no longer be surprised when kindness without boundary produces contempt. You will no longer mistake escalation for misunderstanding. You will no longer confuse explanation with connection. What has been seen cannot be unseen. The pattern does not disappear because you understand it. It loses authority because you no longer confuse it with who you are. You are no longer organized around preventing abandonment at any cost. You are organized around maintaining coherence. That organization will cost you certain roles, certain relationships, certain illusions. This is not a victory, it is a narrowing. The field of possible self-deceptions contracts. The room for unconscious bargains closes. You may feel less warm, less animated, less involved. You may feel quieter. That quiet is not emptiness. It is the absence of constant self-adjustment.